Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Labours of Sports Coaching with myself, Mark Carroll. In today's episode, I want to actually build upon last week's episode, which was, going into the vault and looking back on an interview that I'd done with Cesar Torres, where we actually sort of looked at and Cesar discussed his really nuanced and interesting standpoint on the place and role of competition within youth sport, not necessarily with a self-determination theory or motivational psychology hat on, but certainly in a way that we can infer some stuff from that and sort of consider the implications of that for how we can set up an environment in such a way that people want to continue to come back and they continue to come back for the reasons that across a larger track of time have been observed to be useful and positive for the participant, the young person in a developmental space in terms of the setting within sport that we're discussing. So I'm going to actually now, did it just drop me reflecting on that episode, just, putting it forward again to you guys. I'm actually going to reflect on it now from a self-determination theory standpoint and add to it with my own research. So I'm going to share some stuff today. And this is actually, to be fair, this specific topic is going to be addressed mostly in today's episode, but it's going to form part of a few episodes that I'm going to do where I'm going to now sort of cast an eye over some of the practical conundrums that coaches face that I've certainly observed within a community sports coaching setting, but also actually within sort of performance settings as well. Albeit a lot of the sort of data that I have there is a bit more preliminary, hasn't necessarily undergone the formal analysis yet, but certainly it's been sat there and I've been thinking it through in my head and so on and so forth. So there's I will for today focus more on exact findings, but there is some space to speculate somewhat and think a little bit about what might be discerned in other settings, and you can do the heavy lifting for that as well yourself if you're maybe working more within a performance set. Because actually, I think a lot of youth sport is fairly identical. There are some special considerations for certain pressures on players and coaches that should be taken into account. Yeah, there's some transferable findings that I'm going to share with you. And when I talk about practical stuff, I'm talking about the day-to-day doing of coaching and some of the things that coaches run into, whether it be time, whether it be the group management, the length of time you've worked with the group, the people who are observing the session, how you get engagement within the session, how behaviour manifests across settings. So not just the training session environment, but the match day environment, the competitive environment. So today's episode is going to touch a little bit more on the training setting versus match day and the sort of the role of and the place for and the need to manage competition. Okay, so that's just to kind of set up this episode, kind of give you a reason for why I've proposed this episode and help you sort of look towards the coming weeks because I'm going to go into this stuff a little bit more. It's kind of building on some of the stuff that a previous episode I did a couple of weeks ago, which was more highlighting the lack of structure within community sports settings and how that has implications for motivationally important behaviour. So, and again, I would maybe recommend looking at that. If you're a new listener, guys, please subscribe to the show. Share it. If you're a continued listener but you haven't maybe shared it or maybe you haven't subscribed to the show, please do that. But yeah, okay, so let's get into the thick of it. You've probably heard me in previous episodes speak as somewhat of a cautious advocate of competition because I think it really does get unfairly treated, and I think it's just a training modality like any other within coaching. I think the problem with competition, certainly from a motivational perspective, is that it gets hijacked because of a lot of competing agendas within sport, and certainly if you think about the context of youth sport, there's the competing ethos, I think, of development and performance, and sometimes people get led astray into more of a performance space in their behaviours and working with young people when really they need to be focusing on development. At the same time, they're seen as mutually exclusive things, and I think the issue is that a lot of performance benchmarking can be tackled and evaluated with the use of competition for developmental reasons. But it's again maybe sometimes just it's a lack of skill in doing that then creates this more sort of zero-sum approach with competition that is seen as the be-all and end-all, and we go down a route that, well, under the guise of being developmental, it actually just becomes about about the ego of the coach or the ego involvement of the player. So I think let's start with what could competition be good for? Right, and I'll speak about this again as always in the language of self-determination theory. So from a needs perspective, for internal drivers, it's really important that there's personal meaning is is part of the activity that you're engaged in. So people that do an activity that they find personally meaningful are going to engage in that activity and with more volition for more internally driven reasons, and that over time would in some respects equate to more self-determined motivational orientations, which is better often for engagement longer term, persistence, these sorts of things. Now I say that with an asterisk attached to it because again it's corruptible somewhat, because we might find the competition personally meaningful if it becomes, and we might convince a player to take that on if they don't already. If that personal meaningfulness actually takes them down a track that isn't actually what's best for them, even if they think it's really meaningful to them, when it becomes a case of what the players want versus what they need, and sometimes be different, then in these situations, it doesn't necessarily matter if competition personally meaningful, it can still be damaging, but it can be, if used in the correct way, can sometimes respect where people are at. I always say that it's important to meet people where they're at, and sometimes live in the real world, that recognise that sport is competitive. Sport is also extremely psychologically distressing at times because of the natural fact that you're up against other people. People get nervous. People care about their self-esteem, which they do attach to competition, whether or not we want them to or not. They do it, and sometimes it's important just meeting that reality and therefore being cognizant of that as coaches. So in that respect, competition can allow an opening. It can allow an opening for further conversation that might be about internalizing more extrinsic reasons for doing something and getting those more extrinsic, more external reasons towards a space and a place that are more internally driven over time. But sometimes we do just need to meet people where they're at. I've spoke before about having those conversations about, with players that are about, why you want to do this and what are the benefits of doing it this way, and shaping more internal drivers for something. But you do need to understand where they're at and who's in front of you. So sometimes it's good for that reason, as maybe as a mechanism towards a better place and a higher realm, if you will. So that is one reason why it can be helpful. Also, competition, because it's naturally opposed practice, it's challenging, and therefore with the necessary scaffolding and necessary mitigation that's there to serve, to kind of catch players where they might fall, where perhaps there's an imbalance of ability levels or these sorts of things, wherever you use it in competition and match days or in competition within training sessions. If that's taken care of well, then there's appropriate challenge within the activity that is going to help them be more competent, because it's often representative design in some ways. Let's assume it's more game-based. We can come back to that later on. But by virtue also of, if we're achieving success in those activities, in those competitive activities, it also increases confidence, which might then help the pursuit towards getting players to take on more challenges. So in a mastery pursuit, competition can be an ingredient for higher confidence to take on challenges, and in its natural sort of representative design can be appropriate as well for the actual sense of competence, but also the competence itself, like the literal competence of the player and the skill set of the players. That could be something that could be helpful for them, because they might also be involved in competitive environments. Like I've said, I know sport is innately competitive, but maybe they go and do a tournament and you're actually exposing them to, part of the training is to expose them to some sort of in a supportive environment, but in a sort of incubator for what they're going to face out there in the real world, or out there in the real sport competition, or maybe if it's towards when they're older, as senior athletes, whatever. That competition has a lot of help towards that. There's a wee bit of that happening there too. Also, a lot of competitive practices can be helpful for fostering teamwork, which by virtue of working with people can help to instill a sense of belonging with people, which is all about relatedness, isn't it? So there's a wee bit of that happening there as well. It offers opportunity for people to care for one another, to look after each other, to feel cared for. And these things do really help cultivate that sense of relatedness and help to satisfy that need for relatedness as social beings, and wanting to be part of a tribe and accepted within a tribe. So again, it could be helpful. Now, the problem, as I say, and I might have I kind of cast one eye over this already, but the problem that I say is that all these positive elements of competition require quite clever, careful moderation to ensure that the good stuff is elicited, but the more harmful stuff is kept at bay and is, as I say, moderated, because a lot of this is where coaches, either with all good intentions, go astray, or even worse, claim to have these good intentions. Actually, they use competition to serve their own needs. which I can get onto as well in terms of, sometimes their own emotions, their own goals and these sorts of things. And it's kind of just used as it's just to build character, but you're not really doing it in a way that's ultimately supportive. These sorts of things. That's where there's a bit of a problem. And why, from a motivational psychology perspective, are we got issues sometimes with overemphasizing competition is it's to do with ego involvement. I've said already, mastery focused intentions. The reason why they're good is because they're still about the individual. Ego involvement becomes less about the individual and more about normative comparison. And what I mean by that is that players start to their self-esteem starts to be contingent on showing superiority, or at the very least not showing inferiority to those around them. And if players are constantly placed in a space where they have to compete against other people, their self-esteem and their sense of competence, their confidence as a result of that, perhaps even other things, is insidious sense of relatedness with you as a coach. If you have a sort of conditional regard for them and how you behave with them is different depending on if they won or lost, or how their teammates behave with them is different depending on how they won or lost, or even how their parents behave with them. It's just really terrible, but it can often be the case. It's depending on how they won or lost. These sorts of things create an obsession about that, and it importantly leads to them feeling controlled by the activity. So now they're not doing activity for the internally driven reasons because they love it, enjoy it, or at least it's not the dominant reason for why they're doing it, or because they see some sort of instrumental purpose behind the activity for helping them getting better, those sorts of things. That starts to get out the window, or because they see it's part of their identity, that starts to go out the window and starts to become plays second fiddle to this more controlling need to avoid consequence, to reap rewards, because we'll come back to it, because part of competitions also is around that. But that ego involvement, it essentially starts to put them towards that other end of the motivational spectrum, that are less self-determined and are more controlled. So that's essentially why we don't necessarily view it well, and why when it isn't controlled properly, it can be a real problem. What I'm going to do is talk to you a little bit about some of the findings that I've had through my PhD and other research actually as well, that I feel has relevance here. And we'll start by actually just talking about some examples of the ways that coaches have grappled with competition as a paradox within coaching, because as I've just alluded to there, there's good parts to it, but by trying to attack one part of your job as a coach through competition and doing it for positive reasons, and maybe you can get a positive outcome, there is also a leakage. If it's not for that individual, it might even be within a team setting for other individuals that are affected by it. So there's a lot of stuff that we have to balance here, and it's a lot of spinning plates. But so I'm going to give you some examples of how this happens, and sometimes how this sort of manifests within the real coaching environment, from interviews and observations with coaches across a long period of time. Again, just to bound the work, it is still within a community space that I'm going to talk mostly about here, but transfer it over into your own spaces as you like. Coaches, they believe that competition is a carrot, is helpful in a training environment. Players might find technical exercises boring, and therefore I've found sometimes from coaches that they can use the game at the end as a carrot to say, well, if you engage in this, often it can be a drill or this sort of drier practice that I've got in mind, that we'll then play a game at the end. Not always recognising that the practice itself is going to is almost inducing the need for this other mechanism. But again, and we will come back to this actually, because I'm going to run through some of these, and some of them are interrelated. Similarly speaking, competition, and part of the reason why competition might be used for that reason, to help players get through drier exercises, or because it also is just a good engagement tool in itself, and a lot of coaches do see it, and I've found it in my own practice as well, is a very effective hook for engagement. Players just want to take part in exercises that have got a bit of competitive flair to them. Those things are difficult, insofar as they're helpful there and then, but the more that you use them, the more reliant you and your players will become on them, because you aren't doing the hard work to actually convince them of the utility of the exercise that they are doing, or to also like look after and actually make the activity and more intrinsically engaging in the first place. So those things are important. And even where you are managing, if you are a coach that's able to manage those things well, just as a product of continuously using competition all the time in training, you are inevitably going to allow a lot of normative comparison to seep through. Because if I'm just constantly, everything's a competition, constantly going to players are constantly going to be up against one another, and that's where sometimes mastery is sacrificed for it, for glory and for winning and these sorts of things, and that all of a sudden self-esteem will become up for grabs, or at least be compromised as a result of that. So you then, it just makes it really, it makes it fragile, and it makes it very tough for you as a coach, and something you have to be monitor a lot then is how you manage it. If you're using it a lot, you need to manage it a lot. And that can sometimes be the problem, is that we want to hook players. So competition seems like an easy fix for that. And it does get you a lot of more engagement, but it comes at a cost. Because over time, as I say, it can create more controlled reasons for doing something in the first place. So that's what you typically have seen before. Within training spaces. When we talk about it in a match day environment, it becomes really complicated as well, because players care about winning. Remember I said about just sort of living in the reality of just the way the world is and how athletes are and how sport is. For a whole host of reasons, players care about winning. And therefore, a lot of coaches I've actually observed as well, they've almost said that they almost care about winning for the players, because if you help them win and you recognise that they put a lot of personal meaning onto the competition, the helping them win is almost a route to looking after them, to ensure you're protecting their sense of confidence and stuff like that. And that changes the atmosphere on a match day. And coaches are, by the way, I mean, coaches are known to behave differently from training to match days. There's an article by Smith and colleagues in 2017 that showed increases in control and practice, and decreases in autonomy support practice across training and competition respectively amongst coaches, and that's just as observed. And where I've seen it, and certainly in the coaches that I've observed, where I've seen that come about in a community setting, and it is interpersonally speaking, you'll see less joking about, less humour. So you get coaches that often maybe joke more during the week, but then come the match day, the weekend, all of a sudden maybe they aren't using that same humour. And sometimes it has been explained as to me as a response to the seriousness that the players take the day in. So it's kind of like you're trying to help them. So, and then there's almost as well some of the other sort of external pressures that can come about for the fact that parents also take match day outcomes quite serious, whether they intend to or not. Are they caught up in the emotionality of the setting? I think it's a bit of both. But that in itself can then, particularly where parents can be quite vocal sometimes in that, and if they have feedback to coaches, it can push coaches towards impression management, more performative actions, and being directive, and there's virtue of that being more controlling around trying to get the outcome that coaches perceive the players and the parents to want. It leads to more controlling behaviours. So how does that actually sort of manifest? Coaches can be prone to maybe not giving enough opportunity for decision making by the players. It doesn't, by the way, help them develop their sense of competence and feeling like they can be independent. So it's not just that it doesn't help them actually make independent decisions, but actually feeling like they can do that. It stifles that, and it deprives them of that need to feel competent as well as autonomous. They might actually, be a bit more strategic, overly strategic, maybe not just on a pass by pass basis if coaches are really directive in that way, but maybe even like ensuring that players don't rotate positions a lot. I'm talking in a team context here, just from a lot of the research I've done being in football, not necessarily letting players be flexible and try things and take on risks around things, that sort of thing. It could then all of a sudden be, and I've certainly spoke to coaches as well that have said sometimes it becomes store dependent as well, that the extent to which they do those things. Or a game that isn't close and they're winning by a large margin, all of a sudden the substitutes are on more, all of a sudden players are allowed to try different things more. The coach becomes more joking because they feel the players are in a space where they're able to relax more, versus the game being tight. Subs that maybe initially on paper were meant to come on an X minute, now all of a sudden aren't, or maybe one of them's allowed to come on but not the other one, so we still need to keep this player on at the back, so it becomes quite messy. And a large element of that is also because coaches care about competition ourselves, because we're quite naturally competitive too, and can become quite emotionally charged. Now, in my experience, and also not just from coaching myself, but in terms of some working and talking to other coaches around these factors, when I spoke about earlier on that word paradox, this is where it comes back into play, because that emotionality of the setting isn't just in my view, because it is competitive. Because we're talking about competition in a match day, not as a modality that coaches can choose to use or not choose to use, because they can't do that. It's not optional. It's there, but it's how much they accentuate the meaning of the day that matters. So they can't pick the activity, but they have to then manage the activity. So while coaches can accentuate, the mastery focused parts of the day, and they're trying to achieve this and get players better, if it's not just that the coaches, they be reacting to something in the game, whether it be the coaches on the sideline that they're up against, feeling like having an issue with them and how they're acting and responding to that. Sometimes it's actually about showing the players that they care. So come back to the first thing where I said about how coaches sometimes think a route to competition and winning in competition is a route to helping care for players who care about competition. If that same player who I know cares about competition has had a really bad tackle put onto him, for example, or her, a lot of coaches would say, well, you need to react to that. And then all of a sudden they start gesturing and they start having to go other coaches or referees and things like that, because you might say, well, they shouldn't do that. There's better ways of managing these things, because they aren't often managed assertively. And that's about being neither passive or aggressive. An emotionally intelligent coach should handle things assertively. But by not doing anything, how does that help them signal that they cared to the player? It's like, I've been in the situation where I've been coaching a match and one of my players had a really bad tackle put on him and the referee hasn't given it. And if I stay silent in that communicates to the player that I have not cared enough about what's happened to them. So I need to be in that balance of, and I've done it where I've like been to the ref, like, ref, what was happening there? That's not right. And I need to show somewhat emotion in there. But at the same time, I can't go overkill, because that then suggests things and exacerbates that atmosphere somewhat, perhaps, to the players, or creates other behaviours that are about, getting people back and things like that. It just becomes really poisonous. That's another reason why sometimes these things occur, because that I've just given an example there of how relatedness support can be given is part of relatedness support, is a part of showing care and showing that you're looking out for players. There's a good study, Sparks and colleagues, in 2016, I believe it was, within physical education, looking at some of the things that PE teachers would do and to foster a sense of relatedness with students. And students, one of the comments the students made was about actually the player, the teacher, showing maybe if they've seen someone annoying me or trying to bully me, showing that they've called it out. So showing that you care and looking out for people is part of showing relatedness. So that just shows you how, in managing competition, sometimes I don't think it's useful for a coach to be unemotional, but it's about how they it's the temperament of that, So it's a paradox. So these things are really tough. These things are really, really tough. So we've seen, and if I could go back through some of them and maybe touch on the consequence of it, some of them are self-caused, in my opinion, and some of them create problems for players' motivation as a result. So let's think almost like training situations where in situations competition can be optional. You should decide when you use it, when it becomes an overt part of the training activity, because sometimes players just find a way of being competitive. Anyway, if I'm using competition as a carrot to get engagement, and equally I am on match days, either in response to players or on my own volition, communicating a seriousness about competition or about the outcomes of those things, it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, because players are going to take competition serious if I act serious in competition. Players are going to always require external incentives for doing things, external rewards, bribery through competition and training, if I always say that and do those things and communicate the desired activities in such a way that they have to be seen as something you need to get through, as to get the competition at the end. So we are creating problems for ourselves through our behaviours. And there's some things that we can do on that, and I'll come back to that. I just want to kind of keep thinking about some of this stuff. And also, actions speak louder than words. And if we constantly act either again in reaction to the environment, or because it's how we feel and we have our own values, and then with us as the person, as the coach, is always interfering with our behaviours as well, because it acts in tandem with our environment. If our behaviours don't match up with what we say, then our comments become disingenuous to players, and then all of a sudden it doesn't matter how much you say, players' default position is going to become more ego involved. So if you keep saying that you're in a developmental space, in a development context, it's about development, it's about mastery focus, but as soon as they're 1-0 down, you then start changing how you behave, you start subbing people off, you start reacting to other things in the environment, you become that. that isn't sending the signal to players that the environment is about development. It's the send signals about performance. So your comments become really disingenuous. You're also at risk of your coaching process being hijacked by external actors. So, give an example, parents who, are ignorant often of what we're trying to do as coaches. They just don't know enough. Or they might have their own biases, which, to be honest, they don't have as much of a reason to try and curb. Particularly when they're very individual focused and they've got their babies in front of them essentially, and they don't really care about other people, and they need to be taught to do that a lot of times, or encouraged to do that. It's not the most natural thing sometimes. And we don't really want our coaching process to be hijacked by anyone, not even other coaches or things like that. So that could be a consequence as well about this problem of competition not being correctly catered for, and how we handle it. So there are some of the consequences that coaches are going to start to face in these situations. So what do we do about it? How do we manage competition as a practical conundrum across settings? So for me, it always comes back to training. Okay, for the first instance, training, then there's the external support that we need as well. But training for softer autonomy supported behaviours. So if you feel players, for example, need more internal drivers for why they're doing something, maybe you have a legitimate dry exercise that should be done. And I say a legitimate one because I would actually first ask a coach before thinking about how we need to change the players to change their engagement, like to manufacture the engagement. Should your drill by default not be engaging enough that it comes naturally? So I would actually encourage coaches to look for more interesting ways of getting the same work done. Game-based coaching often is better for that. A lot of drill-based coaching is very dry and or overly organised and something that isn't really meant to be in the way that the game is naturally meant to play out in football, particularly anyway. Take this learning into swimming or tennis, whatever way you want to. But so that's the first thing I would say. But where there is a real legitimate cause for doing it, and at least in what you think is really important that it needs to be done, can you take advantage of softer autonomy supported behaviours to get them to embark on that behaviour more volitionally? So what I mean by that is, are you giving a rationale for those tasks, explaining, look, this is a really important task for this reason, and allowing them to then assign personal relevance and personal meaning to it, because you've given the task credit by explaining it. They might not have realised the real value of doing it. Can you acknowledge their perspective? And let's say they find it really dry. Can you then, one, find out about that? Because maybe you haven't actually found out about it and you're just assuming things. One, find out about that, and also maybe even incorporate their input into changing some condition about the exercise in a way that becomes more engaging. So now they have ownership of it. Now they want to actually engage with it. So now you don't need to necessarily tell them, look, just do this, because if you do it at the end, we'll get a game, or we won't get a game, even more. So sometimes it's the bribe, and sometimes it's the carrot, sometimes it's the stick, and actually threaten not to give them a game. So sometimes that actually is helpful in itself. So softer behaviours, softer autonomy supported behaviours to be really helpful for that. There's also about the surrounding culture that you're trying to build as a coach towards development and against ego involvement, towards mastery focus, as mastery focus is the antithesis of ego involvement. And that's about instilling that mantra with the players, ensuring your behaviours match up, but also to support you through how the environment signals things back to you as a coach that can impact your practice. Collaboration with parents, for example. Do parents understand what's going on in training? Do they understand what's going on in match days? So they understand perhaps that you're not standoffish approach to coaching, because there's a fine line between control and structure. Autonomy support is meant to be highly involved. It's just unrestrictive. So we want to see directives given where they're required. So where, let's say, for example, opportunities or scenarios where players need instruction, you should give it. But where they don't, and where maybe there's freedom and space to allow them to make the mistake and to self-regulate, then allow for that as well. So it's kind of like it's support, it's structuring the environment to give them opportunities to become more independent while still learning. And that's your role as a coach. Allowing parents to understand when you allow for that self-regulation and to understand what you're trying to do, and also to get them to understand what is and isn't acceptable behaviours because of the impact it has on the players. Are you leading them through that? But importantly, do it in a collaborative way, not in a telling them how to parent way. Tell them how you can help them and how they can help you. And, in both ways, it's dialogue. It's the same reason I think it's important to acknowledge the player's perspective for more volitional action, the parent and any other connected stakeholder, whether it be someone that coaches with you that maybe has very opposing views and how you need to work mediate that somehow. These things all play a role. So you need to build a culture, and a lot of that is about getting collaboration with involved actors. Okay, there is also the emotional intelligence for you as a coach that you might need to cultivate, and that's coming back to how you resist the temptation to react emotionally in situations where it's better not to, and to maybe sustain the mantra of perform development over performance, and trying things and failing as a route to become better, but also developing your skill of how to manage situations that do require an emotional reaction, but not in a way that is conducive to good outcomes. So where I spoke about not being passive, not being aggressive, but being assertive in situations where perhaps you need to speak to a referee, where maybe you need to speak to a player, so that you are not coming across as disingenuous because your actions and your words are saying something um, different to one another. So these sorts of things, there's a real emotionality to coaching. Therefore, emotional intelligence matters within that conversation. And I think, and this sort of maybe goes back to the first point about your training of what autonomous supportive coaching can be within a competitive space, and also connected as well, I suppose, to how you can bring other people along in that journey, is we need to sort of find a convergence and ethos of development through competition. Because I spoke right at the start about how competition is a modality, as a development tool, is really potent and really helpful, but it's a dosage problem, and it's about how we manage it in action. I think there's something about how we can develop the sense of autonomy, competence, relatedness through competition. So, in trying to build out of that, to try and see how competition as a useful benchmarking tool is great to a point, but that we have to recognize and communicate other goals within that. So process driven goals, for example, that are more mastery focused, and also more in control of the player, and less zero sum based on winning and not winning, because only so many people can ever win in a match day, you know, individual sport or team sport alone. So there's more chance for success, and that breeds confidence and those sorts of things. To autonomy in terms of helping players figure themselves out, but also at the same time giving them enough directives that they know how to do that. Also knowing when you do just need to tell them what to do as well, which is part of structure, the way, is part of that. To relatedness, how do we foster that sense of belonging and keep communicating that, not just initially, but keep it and maintain it, that sense of belonging, while leading players through competitive environments and through opportunities to develop in competition as a result. It's that sort of idea, and I would, again, I think Cesar Torres, to be honest, does a better job than me of really framing that pursuit of excellence, that shared pursuit of excellence. Just belonging isn't actually just between you and the player, and the player and the teammates, but the player and the teammates and the other team. In the wider, community that have came together, opposing teams, opposing coaches, but in collaboration with one another, that at the higher level, collaboration with one another to each help one another get better. So there's a lot that can be said there. A lot of this is cultural, a lot of this is individual. There's you know that's just the way it is. We need to sometimes think about what you can control, and also what we need to push for, and sort of higher and wider change. So this is just some things that I think about. Is hopefully that's helped you understand a little bit more about the way we view competition from a motivational psychology lens, the way I view it personally as a coach, and also as an academic within this space, and some of the practical conundrums that coaches face, and the way that they use competition, and the role that they see competition having, not just within a training setting, but also within a match day environment as well. So if you get any comments on that, guys, please, I do remind you to email laborsofsportscoaching@mail.com. If you get any feedback, comment as well if the platform allows you to, wherever you listen. Also suggest ideas maybe for future episodes, or if you've got any follow-up questions, maybe I can answer them in future episodes as I start to work through some of these practical conundrums. And the link is, as well as always, for my PhD thesis, is actually in the show notes to this episode too. Okay, so I won't say anything further than that for this week, guys. I hope this has been useful in some way to you, and I will see you next time.